So now we're going to implement user authentication. So the first thing we want to do is create the login page. So let's go back to our Angular application code, and let's go to the Angular CLI, and let's create a new page component. So pages slash, and then I want to say login page. Okay, and now in the pages folder we have the login page. Okay, and here we now want to create a centered div which will hold the login form. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is go to the new list component, because we had a centered div there, and it's called centered content, so that's what we want to create. So let's go back to the login page and create a div with class of centered content, and in here we will have the login form. So I'll create a class of login form, or login box actually. There we go. Save that, and now actually let's go to the Boma documentation so that we can see how to create the login form. So let's go to form and general. Okay, so here we have the username and email. Let's see if we can find a username and password combination. Okay, there we go. So here we have a login form. So let's copy this content here, and let's go back to our code and let's paste it here. Okay, great. And now let's go to the routing module over here, and let's create a new route path. So let's copy new list, for example, paste that, and let's say login, and the component will be the login page component. Okay, great. Save that, close that now, and let's go back to our app, and let's do /login, and there we go. We now get a login form. There are a couple of issues though. The first issue is that we don't have Font Awesome loaded, so these icons aren't being loaded in. So let's go and import Font Awesome. So let's get the CDN. Okay, and let's just copy this, and let's go back to our app, and let's find the index.html, and let's just paste this code here, save that, close that, and go back to our app, and we now have these icons here. Great. And one thing we want to get rid of is this tick icon, which we don't want, so let's get rid of that. Let's go and get rid of this here. Save that, go back, and now we have this here, which looks pretty cool. Okay, so now let's create the white box that will go around it. So let's go back to our code, and let's style the login box. So let's go to the style sheet, and let's create the styles for that. Let's say it will have a margin, let's say it will have padding of 35 pixels, and its background will be white. Save that. Okay, so that looks a bit better now. Let's set the border radius. So border dash radius, and we'll set this to 5 pixels. Save that. That looks a lot better. And now we want to make these fields a light gray so that we have some contrast. So let's go back to our template, and let's say has background light here, and just copy that and paste that here as well. Save that and go back to our app, and that looks a lot better. There we go. Okay, so now we want to style this login button. So let's go here, and let's say that it has background has text white. There we go, that looks a lot better. And now what I want to do is move this login button to the right hand side. So we do actually have a helper class in Boma. Let's find it. Is pulled right. Okay, so let's try that. Let's put it on the field. Save that. So now we have the login button on the right hand side. Great. Okay, so that is pretty much it now. We now have a login form. One thing that I do want to add is a heading here though. So let's add that now. Let's go back here and let's just create a heading. And I'll call this login. Let's see how that looks. Okay, that looks normal. So now let's add the class of title. Save that. So now we have a big heading here. Let's change the font color though. So let's say has text dark. Save that. Okay. Okay, so we've changed it to a primary color. Great. But we actually want to change the font as well and transform the text so that it's uppercase, so that we have the same type of effect as we had here with these titles here. So let's do that now. Let's actually go to the main view and let's see how we did that. The task view. So let's go to the task view. Task view.component.html, and we are doing that using title has text primary, and then we're styling title, aren't we? So let's go to the style sheet for task view. Let's find title. Okay, it's here. Let's move this to the global styles. So let's cut that, save this, and then go to main styles.scss, and we can paste it in here now. There you go, save that. And if we go back to our app, we now have a much nicer heading. Alright then, okay, so now we have the heading there. That's great. We have completed this login form. Okay, so now we have to actually create the functionality for logging in. And to do that, the first thing we have to do is we have to create the user's functionality in the API. Before we do that, let's first talk about our authentication strategy. We are going to be using JSON Web Tokens to authenticate users. JSON Web Tokens are an implementation of a cryptographic verification system, which is stateless. And that means that we don't have to query the database or any data store to verify a user. This means that the API can respond to requests much faster, since we don't have to query the database to check whether the user is who they say they are, and then wait for the database to respond before starting to process the request. The JWT contains a data payload, so that when the API verifies the JWT, it's able to use the information that is in the data payload, such as the user ID, in the database queries. That object will be signed using a secret string that's stored on the server. That means that it's infeasible for anyone to forge a JSON Web Access token, since they won't know the secret value. But there are some disadvantages. So since we don't have to query the database, we aren't able to revoke access for certain tokens. So this means that even if we knew that one certain token was known by a third party, then we still can't revoke access. So for example, let's say we have a user who logged into the application using their laptop, and then they lost the laptop and it was possibly stolen. Well, then they would want to prevent that device from being able to access their data on the application. So we would need a way to prevent that token being used for authentication on our API. And that's why we would want to revoke access for that token. So for example, as you may have seen on some apps and some websites, such as GitHub, that you can see your logged in sessions, and then you can revoke access to some sessions. And this is with many services. For example, here we have Facebook, and you can view your active sessions, and then you can click this button here to revoke access on those devices. And here we have the UI for Telegram, and it also shows you your active sessions, and it will then allow you to close those sessions, which just means revoke access on those devices. So that's what we want to be able to do when we're building applications. We can't do this purely with JSON Web Tokens since they're stateless and we don't query the database on each API request. Therefore, we have to implement some other mechanism so that the user is able to revoke access on logged in devices. And that's where refresh tokens come into play. So we're going to be implementing an authentication system where we have a short-lived access token, which will be using JWT, and a long-lived refresh token, which will just be a randomly generated string that will be stored in the database, and that refresh token will be used to refresh the access token when the access token expires. The access token, which will be a JSON Web Token, will be short-lived, meaning that it has a very short expiry time, maybe something like 10 or 15 minutes. And that's why we need the refresh token, since the client application will need some sort of way of refreshing the access token when it expires. And that's because we can't make the user relog in every 15 minutes. That would be very bad UX. So therefore, the client application will have to make a request to the API using the refresh token that asks the API to generate a new access token, and then the API will have to verify that the refresh token is valid. And if so, then it will generate the new access token and send it back in the response. And then the client application can use that new access token to continue making requests. So that should solve the problem of being able to revoke access on devices. Since the refresh token will be in the database, we can simply delete refresh tokens from the database when we want to revoke access. And therefore, that refresh token can no longer generate new access tokens. And that means we do get the desired functionality. There is one small drawback though. As you may have noticed, the access token will still work even if the refresh token is revoked. But since we set the access token to have a short expiry time, let's say 15 minutes, then that means that if a third party gets access to a device that has an active session and that session is revoked, then that third party will only have a maximum of 15 minutes with access to the API. So that works out pretty well, and it enables us to have the best of both worlds. We are able to get the benefits of stateless authorization, such as a more scalable API and much faster response times. And we also have the benefit of being able to revoke access for certain tokens. Okay then, that's enough talking for now. Let's start implementing this system. So let's go to our API code now. And the first thing we want to do is we want to create a new model. So let's create a new model. User.model.js. Alright then, okay, so let's create the user model now. So let's first get Mongoose. There we go, and let's now create the schema. Okay, so the schema definition. So the first field will be email, which will be type string, and it will be required. And min length will be 1. Trim will be true. And unique will be true. There we go. Okay, so now what we can do. Okay, so now we can create a password. And that will be of type string as well. Required true. And we'll set the min length to 8. There we go. And we now also have to create the sessions, which will be an array, which will contain objects, and these objects will contain a token field, type string, and required true, and also an expiry time, type number, as that will use the Unix timestamp. So that will be a number, and then required will be true as well. Okay, so that's what we have to do. So that is all we have to do now for that. So now what we want to do is create some instance methods. And the first one will be the toJSON method, which will be overriding the default toJSON method. And that's equal to a function. And we are using a regular function here, not an arrow function, purely because we need to have access to the this keyword. So const user is equal to this. And then we can do const user object, which will be user.toObject. There we go. And we now want to return the document except the password and sessions. These shouldn't be made public, or these shouldn't be made available. There we go. Okay, so that is the reason we have to create this toJSON method, purely because we want to override the default toJSON, which will return all of our fields, which we don't want. So now we can do return, and here we actually want to use a library called Lodash. So let me create a new terminal here, and let's install Lodash. And we can now import it. So now we can use a Lodash method and then return the result from that. So we pass in the user object, and we now pass in an array of the fields we want to omit. So the first one will be password, and the second one will be sessions. Great. So that's done now. Now we can create a second instance method, which will generate the access token. So let's create that now. And that's equal to function and const user this. There we go. And now we're going to return a new promise, which will have the resolve and reject. There we go. And here we now want to create the JWT, the JSON Web Token. Create the JSON Web Token and return that. So we first have to install it from npm. So JSON Web Token, save that. And let's import that now. So const JWT require JSON Web Token. There we go. Okay, save that now. And we can now create the JWT. So to create a JWT, we have to use the sign method. So JWT.sign, and we will now get a payload. And here we will put the ID. So we'll get the ID. And here we will do the user._ID .2hex string. There we go. And we will then put in the secret or private key. And for this, I'm going to create a constant for. So let's just let's say JWT secret, and here we'll do const JWT secrets, and here we have to get some random string. So for that, let me go and generate some. So generate random string. Okay, let's get strings and let's copy a few of them. Copy that one, copy that one, copy that one, and let's just put in some random letters, and let's get one more. Okay, so we now have a secret that's fairly random, and we can now use this here and pass in the secret. And then we have to put in the options, and we have to say expires in and set how long it will take to expire. And here we will put in 15 minutes, like that. Okay, save that now. Okay, and now we have a callback here, where we get the error, or the encoded token. So in here, we will put some error checking. So when there's not an error, then we will call resolve and pass the token. And else, so there is an error, then we'll reject. There we go. Okay, so that's what we have to do there. That will now generate the access auth token. And we now want to create a method for generating the refresh token. So let's create that now. So generate refresh auth token is equal to function. And here we will return new promise. And we'll get the resolve and reject. And here we want to generate a random 64-byte hex string, as that comment states. So here, what we'll do is we'll use the crypto library, which is built into NodeJS. So let's load that in here, like that. And now here we can do crypto.randomBytes, and we'll pass it in 64, and we'll now get a callback. We'll get the error and the buffer. Okay, so when there's not an error, then we'll let token, and we'll get the token from the buffer in hex format. There we go. And we'll return resolve token. That's all we have to do there. Okay, so now we can move on, and we can now create the save session to database method, which will save the session to the database. So let's do that. Let's create the save session to database method now, which won't be an instance method, but will be a helper method. So let's define it like this. So let's save session to database, and that's going to be equal to an arrow function, where we get the user and the refresh token. Okay, and here we'll save session to database. So return new promise, and we'll get resolve and reject, and we'll let expires at, and that will be equal to generate refresh token expiry time. And that is a method that we have to create now. So let's create that now quickly. Let's quickly create that. And it's just this code here, which is pretty simple. And I'll set this as days until expire. I'll set this to I would say 10 days. So save that. So that will now generate a Unix timestamp for 10 days from now. Okay, so now let's go back to our method here. And here what I'll do is I'll do user.sessions.push, and then we'll pass in the item. So we'll set token to refresh token and expires that. There we go. That's all we have to do. That will simply take the user document and push this object to the sessions array. That's all it will do. So save that. And we now want to create the create session method, which we'll do up here. So user schema dot methods dot create session, and that's equal to a function, and let user is equal to this, and we'll return user dot generate refresh auth token dot then, and we'll get the refresh token back, and here we'll return save session to database, and we'll just pass in that user and the refresh token. There we go. And then we'll chain onto that a dot then, where we'll get the refresh token returned back. And the reason we are going to get that returned back is because here we actually have to add some more code. So we have to actually save this user document. So let's save that. Do dot then. And here's what's going to happen. So here the session has been saved successfully. So we return resolve with the refresh token so that we can then chain a dot then and retrieve that refresh token back. Else, when there's an error, we will then reject and pass the error. Okay, so that's what we have to do there. Save that, and we now have access to the refresh token here. And what we'll do here is we'll just return that. So let's just return that, and we can then put a catch here. And we'll simply return a promise.reject that will contain the error. Okay, that's it for that method. And actually we want to put some comments here. So here we have the instance methods, and here we have helper methods. So let's create a comment for helper methods. Helper methods. Great. And now we're going to create some model methods, which are static methods. Model methods, which are static methods, which means that these methods can be called on the model and not an instance of a model. So not a user object, but the user model class. So now let's create some model methods. The first one will be user schema dot statics dot find by ID and token, which is going to be a function which will take in the ID and the token. And here we have to find by ID and token. So there we go. So const user is equal to this, and we will then return user.find1, and we'll find by the ID, and the sessions dot token will be token. That's all we have to do. So now we can move on and we can create the find by credentials. So let's create that now. User schema dot statics dot find by credentials, which will take in the email and the password, and let user is equal to this. So before I do this, the first thing I want to do is actually create some middleware here that hashes the password, because we will be using that in this method here. So let's create some middleware. Here, let's create some middleware. So let's put a comment here. Okay, so we will be creating this middleware here. So let user is equal to this. And now we want to install bcrypt, which is what we'll be using to hash our passwords. So let's install that. And we will be using the bcrypt.js library. So save that. And we can load that in at the top. Const bcrypt is equal to require bcrypt.js. Save that and go back down to our method. Okay, so here we can now do let cost factor and set that to 10. And that is what we use in bcrypt to determine the number of hashing rounds, which basically just means how long it will take to hash our passwords. So now we want to put an if statement here. User.isModified and put in password here. Okay. So what this code is saying is that if the password field has been edited, changed, then run this code. We would want to then hash the password here, because we don't want to save the plaintext password in our database. So let's now use bcrypt to hash our password. We will now generate the salt and hash the password. So gen salt, and we'll put in the cost factor here, and we'll get a callback here. And we'll now hash the password. So .hash, and we'll get the user.password, and we'll get the salt, and we'll get the callback here. There we go. And here we will set user.password to hash, and then run next. So that's how we will hash the passwords. And also we have to put an else statement here and just call next. There we go. Okay, so that's pretty much it for that. Now let's go back to find by credentials. So here we want to do return. So here we want to do user.findOne and pass in the email, and then do .then and grab the user document from there. And if there is no user, then return promise.reject. Yep, that's all we have to do there. And if there is a user, then return new promise with resolve and reject being passed in this callback. And then we will do bcrypt.compare to compare the password and the hashed password in the database. So user.password, and we'll now get the callback. So now what we will do is so if there is a result, then resolve user, and if not, then reject. Okay, that's all we have to do now. So let's save that, and we've actually fully implemented the methods needed for authentication in the user model. Great. Okay, so now let's go to the bottom, and let's do const user is equal to mongoose.model user and user schema. There we go. And do module.exports user. Alright, save that. One last method that I forgot to implement is the has refresh token expired method. So let's just create that now. .statics .has refresh token expired, which is equal to an arrow function. Okay, and we'll get the seconds since epoch, which is the first time that the Linux timestamp started from, which was in 1970, I believe. And we'll set that to date.now divided by 1,000 to get the seconds, because that's in milliseconds, date.now. Okay, and then we'll have an if statement, and if it expires at greater than seconds since epoch, then return false. So it hasn't expired. Else, return true. Has expired. Okay, so save that, and now we are fully complete with the methods in the user schema. So now we have to create the routes for user. So let's go to app.js and let's start creating the routes. Okay, so user routes. Okay, so the first route that we'll create is the sign up route, post/users, and the purpose will be sign up. And here we will do app.post, and we'll get /users, and we'll get the request and response as usual. And here we will sign up. So we will get the JSON body is equal to request.body, and we'll create the new user. And we actually have to import the user model. So to do that, we have to go to the index.js in the models folder and import user. Save that and go back to app.js and scroll up, and we have to import that here. There we go. Okay, so let's go back down here, and then we'll just pass in the body. Okay then, and then we can do new user.save .then and we'll return new user.create session to create the session, and then we can chain a .then, so we'll get the refresh token here. So now the session has been created successfully, and the refresh token has been returned. So now we have to generate an access auth token for the user. Okay, so let's return new user generate access auth token, which is the method that we have just created here, somewhere here, generates, yep, here. So that method here. So let's call that here, and we can do .then, and the access token is returned to us. Okay, so we now have access to the auth token and the refresh token, so we can return an object containing the two auth tokens so that the client can receive those. Okay, and now we can do a .then as well here and grab those auth tokens. And here we construct and send the response to the user, and we do that using this code here. And now we can do a .catch and get the error, and do response.status 400.send the error. Okay, there we go. So we've completed the sign up route. Now let's create the login route. So that will be post/users/login, and it will be app.post/users/login, and we'll get the request and response. And here we can now get the email and get the password. And we can now do user.findByCredentials, which was one of the instance methods that we just created. And in here we can pass the email and password and do .then, and the user is returned back to us. And now we can do return user.createSession .then, and the refresh token will be returned to us like last time because we did the same thing here. Okay, so we can now get this. Okay, so the session has been created successfully, and we can now generate the access auth token. So that's done with this code here. And then we return them. And then we can do a .then here. And get those auth tokens. And then we can do the same thing as we did before. So let's copy and paste this code here. And paste it there. Great, save that. And then we can put a catch at the end. So here we can do a .catch. There we go. Save that, and that's all done for the login route. So now we have enough code to test this out in Postman. So let's get Postman up and running. Okay, so let's create a post request to /users to create a user, and in the body we'll put JSON, and we'll put the email and password here, test@test.com, and we'll put a password here, and it has to be 8 characters, so I'll put hello world as the password. And now we can press send. Okay, we get user is not a constructor. Okay, so we're getting an error somewhere. I think it's when we do new user, that's probably it. New user, and then we pass in the body. We are loading in user. Okay, yes, so it's because in the index.js we have to actually put user here. That's why we were getting the error. Okay, so let's save that, and let's go back to Postman, and let's try that again. Press send, and we get an error here. Failed to save session to database. Refresh token is not defined. Failed to save session to database. So in create session, something must be going wrong. So let's go back to create session in the model.js. Let's go to create session. Okay, yeah, so it's because we misspelt this. Let's just... Okay, let's save that now, and it should work. Okay, we get a duplicate key. Okay, that's good, so that means it worked before. Okay, so let's change this now to test1 and press send. Again, we get a bad request. Okay, let's see why that's happening. We're not getting an error, we're just getting this object here, auth token. It's because we misspelled this, so it's auth tokens, so let's save that now. Okay, and it should hopefully work now this time. If we try that again. That's a duplicate key, cool. If we type test3, press send, there we go. So we now get the user object back. So we now have sign up completely working in our application, which is great. Okay, so now let's test the login route. So let's create a new route here. Let's create a new request here, and let's set this to post. And let's go localhost 3000/users/login, and go to body, raw JSON, and let's copy over this here, paste it in, and press send. Okay, and we're getting this again, and that's because we still have that misspelt, right? We have misspelt something somewhere. Oh, okay, right, yeah, so it's because we are sending new user, which doesn't exist here, because we copy and paste it from here. So let's just change this to user, and that will now work. So let's try that again. Okay, still not working. Still not working. Okay. That should work. I don't know why that's not working. So we have user.findByCredentials. We pass in the email and password. That works. We get the user document back. We then do create session. Dot then refresh token. We do generate access auth token. Oh, okay, right. So we misspelled this. Okay, so that's an issue. Okay, so save this now and go back to Postman and try this again. So there we go. We have our user document returned. And if we go to the headers, so here we have the refresh token and the access token returned to us in the headers. That's amazing. Okay, so that route works. That's really good. So now let's create a route that generates and returns an access token. So let's do that now. Okay, so let's create that. So it would be a GET request. So it will be /users/me/access token. Okay, there we go. And we'll get the request and response objects as usual. So before we implement this, we first have to create some middleware that is able to verify that the caller of this route is authorized to access this route, because what this route will do is it will generate an access token, which is an important credential which will authorize the caller to access protected resources. So we have to implement some sort of middleware that is able to check whether the caller has correct authorization, which in other words means that this middleware will have to check the headers of the request and make sure that the refresh token is valid. Okay, so let's create that now. Alright then, okay, so let's now create the middleware that will grab the refresh token from the header and then check if that token is valid. So let's scroll up and let's go to the middleware part of the code, where we are now loading in the middleware here. So let's create a comment here. Okay. So here we want to create the verify refresh token middleware, which will be verifying the session. Okay, so let's now create the middleware. We'll get the request object, the response object, and next. Okay, so the first thing we can do is grab the refresh token from the header, like that. Okay, pretty simple. And then we want to grab the ID from the request header as well. Those are the two pieces of data we need to verify the session, because we will be using these to query the database. So here we can do user.findById and token, and pass in the ID and the token. Do .then, and we'll get the user object back. And here we can have an if statement that checks whether the user object has a value. So the user couldn't be found. So here we will return a promise.reject, and we'll pass in an object, which will be the reason, and we'll say that the that it's because the user not found, and make sure that the refresh token and user ID are valid, are correct. Okay, there you go. Okay, so that's all we have to do for that one. And then down below, the user was found. So therefore, the session is valid. So here what we want to do is put some values onto the request object. So we can do request.user ID is equal to user._ID, and we can do the same thing with the refresh token. So now what we want to do is check whether the session has expired or not. So here's what we can do. User.sessions.forEach, and then we will get the session back. We can put an if statement here. Check if the session.token is equal to the refresh token, and then we can check if the session has expired, and we'll use the helper method that we put on the user model. So it has refresh token expired, and we pass in the session.expires_at value. And here we have to create a variable. So let is session valid, and that will be false by default. And here we can set that as true. Okay, cool. So and now outside of the loop, we can check that value. And here we can call next, and else the session is not valid. Then here what we can do is return a promise.reject like before, and pass in an error, and put the message as refresh token has expired, or the session is invalid. Okay, and also here we can change the comment here. Therefore, the refresh token exists in the database, but we still have to check if it has expired or not. Okay, and here we can put a comment, the session is valid, call next to continue with processing this web request. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this middleware. One thing we do want to do though is put a catch statement on this promise. So here we can, where is that? Okay, yeah, so here we can do a .catch, get the error back, and here we can do response.status 401, which means it's unauthorized, and .send, and pass in that error. That's all we have to do for that. And now we can use this in our root handlers. So let's go here, and now let's use this middleware. So let's pass it in here. So one mistake that I've made here is actually we don't have to put this within the app.use. Let's just cut this text here. Cut that, and let's not use app.use, because that's actually that would have applied the middleware to all of our requests, but we actually only want to manually apply it to some requests. So let's actually just set that as a normal method. So let's verify session, and then just paste that back in. And now we can use this within our root handlers by going to the root handler, and we can now put it here. Okay, so that will now apply that middleware to this root. Okay, so we know that the user caller is authenticated, and we have the user ID available to us. Okay, so one more thing we actually want to do is we can go back up to the middleware here, And we can also set the user object. So request.user object and set that to the user. Okay, so now we have access to this user object. User ID and user object. Okay, so now we can do request.userObject.generate the auth token .then, and we'll get back the access token. And we can set the response.header and set the access token. Set that to the access token, and then .send. And we can also send back the access token here. What we're doing here is we are providing two ways for the client to grab that access token back. So the caller can either look at the response headers, or they could just look at the response body. But basically, we are just sending the same data twice. This might be a bit inefficient, but it's not a big deal, and it provides the client two ways of accessing the token. You can remove one, and it will still work perfectly fine, just as long as the client knows which one to pick. But I mean, that's not really an issue because we are creating the client ourselves anyway. It's not a big deal to send it twice, but you may only want to send it once. Okay, so that's what we're going to do there, and we're going to do a catch as well, where we will get the error. And here we will do response.status and send a 400 and send the error back. Okay, so that route is done. Now let's test out on Postman. Alright then, okay, so let's create a new request. Let's set it to get localhost 3000 /users/me/access token. Let's just send it without putting the headers and see what happens. Okay, so we get token is not defined. Okay, that's perfectly fine. Let's try and now put in the headers, and we'll get the user ID, and we'll set that to, let's find one of the users. So let's find the login route. Okay, so let's log in and let's get the user ID. Okay, let's copy that and let's go here and let's paste in the ID. And let's get the refresh token from the headers. Okay, and copy that and go back to this request and paste in the refresh token there. Okay, and now let's press send and see what happens. Okay, we're still getting the same error. Okay, so let's see what's happening there. Token is not defined. Token is not defined. Line 35. Okay, so it's up here. Okay, so the token. Oh, okay, right. So we need the refresh token. That's why. Okay, let's save that now and let's do that again. Send. Refresh token has expired or the session is invalid. Okay, so that's not great. So that's happening in the code somewhere. It's here. So this is failing. Okay, so oh right, okay, so it's because I misnamed this. So this has to be X refresh token. That's it. Okay. There we go. Okay, so now we're getting a different error. Interesting. Okay, so user not found. Make sure that the refresh token and user ID are correct. So that's here. So a user can't be found with those values. So let's go to the model and see what's happening in the model. Find by ID and token. We get the ID and the token. Oh, okay, so here we put session.token and not sessions.token. So that has to be sessions.token. So let's save this and let's try that again. Send. Okay, so great. So now it's working, and we can see that this is changing each time we send the request, which means it's creating brand new access tokens each time we send the request, which is great. Okay, so that's working now. So now we can go back to our Angular application and start implementing the login system on the front end.